If John's Gospel is written somewhere between 80 and 85 or 90 AD, I personally believe that it was an earlier date rather than a later one, in the sense that it most probably was around about 80 AD. Now, we don't know where John was at the time, but we do know that he was in Ephesus for a fair amount of time. And we know that even in Ephesus, what he did was he taught a number of people, one of which was the early church bishop called Polycarp. Polycarp taught Irenaeus, and so on. And so we see that John has a connection with some of the early church fathers of the early Christian church. After Ephesus, we believe that he was exiled to a little island off the coast of Ephesus called Patmos. And it is there that he begins to continue writing, or he continues to write. And particularly, we believe that one of the things he would have written there was the Revelation. And so we don't really know when he wrote the Gospels or where he wrote the Gospel. But potentially he wrote it in Ephesus. Possibly he wrote it from somewhere else. But we think that what happened in the ensuing 10 years after the writing of the Gospel was that people got the wrong end of the stick. And possibly the reason why they got the wrong end of the stick was because of the association of the early church with some of the other religions of the Roman Empire. Some of the other religions of the empire, we get a connection with a little bit in Paul, where it tells us that Paul goes to Athens. And when he's in Athens, he goes up on the Areopagus, which is called Mars Hill. And what he does up there is he has a debate with the philosophers that are there. And he debates with them about this unknown God. Now, the very interesting thing is who he's debating with. Because he's debating with Epicureans and Stoics. Now, Epicureans believed that life is all about pleasure. Eat, drink, be merry, because you're going to die anyway. And so Epicureans were all about the pursuit of pleasure, and that meaning and purpose is found in the pursuit of pleasure. The Stoics were the diametrical opposites of that. The Stoics believed that we need to get rid of all human emotion, that we need to reduce ourselves from emotional beings into rational beings, and that's how we will also reach an enlightenment, a state of bliss. The interesting thing is that neither of them really believed in gods. Neither of them believed that, in fact, it was really the application of gods that got them to that position. It was rather more the human activity. And so it's interesting that even by the time that Paul goes to the Areopagus, we see that already the process of getting rid of the gods and bringing in thinking, reasoning into the process of religion has already begun to happen even in Athens. I believe the same thing was happening in the time of John. That by the time John wrote his gospel, it was snapped up by these people whose religious faith was all in their process of reasoning, was all in the process of the spiritual rather than anything physical. It wasn't based in all the gods, but rather based in this concept of a divine knowledge, a divine knowledge. Now that concept of divine knowledge there's a Greek word for it, which is the word gnosis. That's where we get the word knowledge from. Knowledge comes from gnosis, which is a Greek word. And there was a group who believed that, in fact, they could have divine knowledge, that they could have knowledge that nobody else had. They became known later on as the Gnostics. And what they also believed, therefore, was that everything that wasn't divine knowledge was evil. So essentially our bodies, the world, other people, essentially were all evil. The only thing that was good was that divine spark of gnosis. Now, you can imagine that John's gospel would very quickly be a source text for them. Would very quickly be something that they would look at and go, oh, that's exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about the divinity of Jesus. He's talking about Jesus being divine rather than this human Jesus that we get in the Synoptic Gospels. What we see that maybe what was happening is that this beginning movement to move away from humanity as being something that we need to serve and we need to redeem and we need to reconnect with God, instead this movement towards this divine knowledge, this spark of divinity within us. That spark of divinity, which was like the divine Jesus who came. And so we can see how this religion could have developed and how John's gospel could be possibly used as a source text to actually give them some credence. I believe it's one of the great reasons why we have the 4 Gospels. I think one of the reasons why the 4 Gospels are within our canon is to give us the balance. The Synoptic Gospels giving us the concept of Jesus' humanity, and John's Gospel giving us the balance in Jesus' divinity. The two need to go together, otherwise we end up with the imbalance. Too much of the Synoptics, and all what we end up with is Jesus being a good guy. Really no different to any of the other prophets who had come, whether it be Moses or Muhammad or Buddha. However, on the other side, we have the divinity of Jesus. And it's in that divinity of Jesus that if we focus too heavily on that, then all that is flesh becomes evil. All that is flesh needs to be removed in order to release that divine spark, the divine gnosis or knowledge that God has placed within us. We need both, so that we have the divine knowledge of God, not our divinity within ourselves, but rather to redeem our humanity, to make us the human beings we were meant to be. And that's why John writes his 3 epistles, 1, 2, and 3 John. In many ways, what those 3 epistles are trying to do is to redress the imbalance that his gospel may have caused. I think that maybe what happened was that John began to hear the sayings or the people who were speaking from a Gnostic perspective. They were speaking from that divine perspective, that spiritual perspective. And what John wanted to do was to correct that and say, no, it's no use just talking about divinity and about spirituality. We also need to make sure that we understand to put it into practice. I think that his gospel is eminently practical. I think that it was misinterpreted on purpose. It was misinterpreted in order to connect with the people who already had Gnostic views. My concern is that too often the church today is still Gnostic. That too often today the church has still got that Gnostic edge where it's all about that we have some divine knowledge and that our churches are all spiritual and we can sing and we can wave our arms and we can fall over and we can do all those kind of things in church, and somehow that's real worship. In fact, John 13 tells us that true worship is when we take the towel and the bowl and wash each other's feet. What we see in Jesus is not some miraculous divinity who has no connection to humanity. What we see is a divinity who is prepared to become the servant in order to save humanity. Because humanity is worth saving. The world is worth saving. And Jesus comes because it is worth saving. For God so loved the world that he gave his Son. The first 3 letters then, or the letters of John, are written not in order just for these short letters to be ignored, but rather to counterbalance our innate ability to want to become like God, rather than to become what God intended us to be, the human beings that he made us.